Welcome to Login's Maximum IT Podcast, the ultimate tech resource for small business owners. Stay ahead of the curve with the latest IT news, expert insights, and essential cybersecurity tips to keep your business protected and running smoothly. From simplifying tech solutions to safeguarding your data, we bring you the knowledge you need to thrive in today's digital world. Technology moves fast. Don't get left behind. This is Login's Maximum IT Podcast. Let's dive in.
Good morning and welcome to episode 1 of Login's Maximum IT Podcast. Super excited to get this rolling. Today we are joined by none other than the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. John Bolthouse of Login. Super excited to have this conversation with you, John. I see you smiling over there. With that said, John, do you want to give us a little bit of your background at Login and what you're doing for us now?
Definitely. I came to Login initially as a developer working on network and voice solutions, and got to know the culture, got to know some of our customers, understood more about the offerings that we were bringing to market as we did. And the timing was fortuitous because we, as Login, wanted to start venturing into the managed IT space. It was in the same time frame as when a lot of the relationships that we had with existing customers were coming to that kind of level of maturity. And
Right.
so as I got to watch that happen, was able to bring some of my background in managed IT to help us craft this solution. I also got to see a real shift in a desire for this among our customer base, and that was largely along the lines of enhanced security and really feeling a sense of safety.
Right.
And we can get into more about that, but that really was where a lot of this started, and it's been pretty awesome to see over the last couple of years how this has all come together.
Right. And I mean, having been a part of this, just like you, and watching it all come together has been a very, very exciting thing. Speaking on the managed IT side of things, you kind of brought up the security side, but I am curious, can you tell us a little bit about the differences between in-house IT for a business versus a full-blown MSP or managed IT service and how they kind of differentiate from each other? And also there's some similarities, obviously, but I'm curious on your take on it.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I think people do think about those things, not just when they're deciding how to allocate budgets or to think through IT, but they're also thinking about their business. Is this going to help me continue to grow? Am I going to be able to scale and continue to develop with a provider plugged in? Or is it better for me to have somebody on staff or multiple people on staff? So really, they aim to be similar, but there
Right.
are advantages and disadvantages. Managed IT providers tend to have better tools and knowledge purely because of the scale that they work in.
Right.
But traditional IT providers have more of an acute business historical knowledge. They know their business, they've been a part of it. A lot of times they're either one of the owners or somebody really integral to the operation. So they really have that deep cultural understanding, which helps them triage very naturally. And then also to be able to create good right fit solutions that, again, a provider will take time to try to understand those things. There are a lot of commonalities between businesses, but assessing risk, understanding what are the right solutions to plug in at certain times, all of that is handled differently by the traditional IT vendor than it does by MSP. So managed IT ends up being more economical in most cases due to that
Yeah.
scalability, but support can suffer if it's not made a premium at the provider. And I think that is a big concern or complaint among a lot of MSPs is, yeah, the price is good and all the offerings are there, but it's very hard to get the level of attention and care that we need in order to feel comfortable to keep doing business, leveraging that technology.
Right. So I completely agree with you. And to kind of continue that thought a little bit further, I've started noticing, at least on my side of the login family, that there is a huge correlation between co-managed IT and regular MSP services. And I know co-managed tends to kind of instill a little bit of fear or apprehension in existing traditional in-house IT teams, but really we're there to augment existing efforts. And you kind of touched on that a little bit with knowing company culture and triaging, company known problems, right? So in your engineering experience, how can the MSP or managed IT provider and an existing in-house IT provider kind of exist in a symbiotic relationship?
Yeah. So I think most commonly people think that managed IT means all of my technology.
Right,
And that actually isn't the case. In fact, it's more rare for us to have full responsibility for all the technology at a particular customer. Usually, we're asked to plug in at different levels.
right,
Most often, it is focused on the security of the business online. So, like Microsoft or Google tenancy management, license management, endpoint management, protection, those are all areas that managed IT really it connects in quickly. But another misconception with that is that managed IT ends up replacing on-premise IT. If we engaged managed IT, are they just going to overtake that over time? Well, this gets back
right,
to what we said before. The best symbiotic relationship is a well-placed, technical, focused person in the organization, usually an IT person, um, and being able to augment that. Now, it can be true for larger organizations when there are large budgets and trying to decide how are you going to allocate expenses, that sort of thing. But for the
right,
small to medium business, especially, it really is this question of how do we augment existing IT? How do we take things that they want to give over to somebody else that maybe to them either seem mundane or repetitive, or they that chew up a lot of their time, so that they can get focused on the projects that they need to do to be able to move their business forward. And that's a really great space because you do need that technical person on your staff at your company that can push value forward from that sort of CTO or that technical perspective to back that up. But they need time to understand what that technology is. They need time to research and compare. They need to make sure that they can provide best fit. And if they're handling all of the support, if they're handling security issues that come up, that's just chewing away at their time. So that's a real common place for managed IT to come in and walk hand in hand with managed IT, with the on-prem IT person.
right. And then that
Sometimes
also kind of ties into the support side of things on off hours and that sort of deal where, maybe their internal IT is only 8 or 9 to 5, and what's happening on the off hours side of things, right? Where it's who's going to deal with it when the internal IT team isn't there? Are they letting it sit overnight before things get triaged? So lots
yeah,
of
exactly.
symbiotic relationships going on there. And also kind of moving again forward with the thought process that you just laid out. I think a lot of what a managed IT provider can bring is automation to existing processes to, again, augment what that internal IT specialist or CTO level person is trying to get done, right? And save them time and effort so they can drive the value in moving company processes forward, right? So I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious on your take on automation and how that plays into a small or medium-sized business or even large scale, right? Because we do try and automate certain processes, but there's also certain things that may not want to be automated. So, can you touch on that a little bit?
Definitely, yeah. It's that's an important aspect of what managed IT aims to do. I would say that automation is the heavy hitter. Deployment is like a big area of making sure that things are rolled out appropriately. It has gotten much simpler in recent years with excellent tooling from MDM providers or RMM providers for different sorts of management layers,
Right.
as well as evolutions of directory models like Azure AD and Entra, being able to think more about how do we deploy at scale rather
Yep.
than in specific areas. So that's a huge component of it. Another area is in threat detection and response. Networks can now be very, very smart. choking off specific endpoints that have been compromised while letting the rest of the network continue to operate. And with the right vendors and the right setup with that, when there is a threat that emerges, the IT personnel, whether on-prem or at the managed IT provider, are notified and they're able to respond. But also, action is taken automatically on the network to mitigate that threat, cutting them off from valuable resources that that compromised endpoint might be able to have access to. So that kind of automation is also very, very important. And I would
Right.
say
And
finally, the automation in patching and upgrades and driver installation, all of those things that just each one of them takes a little bit more time, means that if that's well deployed with policy rolled out in a way that's fairly consistent, not only inside of a company, but across other companies, so that there's standards that are applied, then IT staff, MSP staff, they can stay focused on delivering value. They can focus on better levels of support, and they can also continue to enhance the value at their organization to their own people. And that's really the holy grail, getting enough time to learn what's new, stay
right.
ahead, and then serve your people. And that's just always the look, like, how can we automate this so we can stay focused on doing better for our people?
Right. And I couldn't agree with you more. And you had touched on some endpoint isolation capabilities. And I think that's come along really far in the last couple of years, especially with the generative AI being played into that now as well. And it kind of determining whether or not it needs to isolate something on the network is a huge thing instead of just locking everything out when you only have one endpoint that may have had a security risk or a
Right.
security event, and allowing either that CTO level person or the MSP that you're utilizing evaluate and respond. So,
Yeah, and it sometimes does go wrong, and we did see that with CrowdStrike and some of the
yeah,
craziness there. However, by and large, this almost social agreement that we're going to sacrifice a little bit of our hard knowledge of how everything operates into that space of intelligence and automation, trying to create a response to distributed attacks on systems by having a distributed response to those attacks. All these great new technologies, great new available methods of being able to do that are not only being widely distributed, but in a lot of cases they're being made free. They're made available so that there isn't a cost barrier to adoption. Now, there still is cost to support, and that's where a lot of cybersecurity products and things tend to get more expensive, because there is baked in high level of support for mitigation. But at the base layer, being able to keep the world more protected from these emerging threats more and more, the response levels are ratcheting up more and more and more. So it's also very, very important that people understand what they can layer in and what they can do to ensure that they're in the very best security posture. And honestly, there's a lot that can be done for free. That's just
right.
around training and understanding. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's really the vein there, is making sure that that is focused on consistently.
and I agree with you. I think a big value add in engaging an MSP, even if you do have an internal IT team, is the access to the brain trust of very high level engineers, right? That may provide a different perspective on that security posture that you were just talking about versus one or two people that are trying to do what's best for their business and may benefit from some outside thinking or at least some outside perspective to come up with the best solution for that very specific situation, right?
Hmm.
Um, with that said, and this kind of ties in a little bit, we're seeing a huge push towards cloud infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see it all the time at Login. And one thing I'm kind of curious about from an engineering perspective is we're seeing a lot of people move away from bare metal machines, right? Big physical servers that sit in an IT closet somewhere, and moving towards a VM or VPS style infrastructure. And they're saving huge amounts of money. And we're seeing pretty darn good performance in moving to that cloud infrastructure. But I'm curious, is there a point at which an engineer would say, no, this needs to be dedicated bare metal versus moving towards that cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, that conversation requires nuance every bit of direction. It all depends on what the the uh, the workload is going to be.
Right.
And so the way that we typically look at it is we try to understand what it is that is, what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Um, if it is very, very high levels of performance, um, a good example of that would be if there's a number of people that are doing video editing on a local network. Well,
Right.
we're going to engineer compute and storage relative to the data that they need access to, the proxy data for their video editing, all of those things in a way that allows them to not have lag because that just takes up more time versus putting that in our data center. But if it is, hey, we want to be able to access our QuickBooks, we're not ready to go to QuickBooks Online yet. We really want to stay with some of the core, desktop sort of features. Well, putting that workload into our data center as a virtual machine makes a lot of sense because we can back it up right there. It's safe right there, as
Yep.
well as we can make that available through the network via VPN and other technologies to be able to really work from wherever. And because that is a remote access scenario, the compromise level, the threat to compromise goes way, way down compared
Right.
to having that QuickBooks on a computer on-prem. So those are, I think, some of the more common scenarios that we run into. There are more advanced ones that require a little more thinking, and one that is very interesting right now is um, it's very tempting to go directly to AWS or Google or whatnot because you can go turn on a virtual machine and just spin it up and start working with things. However, it gets back to that whenever you try to scale, and these groups call themselves hyperscalers, so they're scaling as fast as they can.
Right.
Um, and when you work with them, support often is the struggle. Something goes wrong, and you may wait a week or two when you are a new startup or this is your first time spinning up a VM. But you have organizations that have millions of dollars of revenue and massive infrastructure still complaining about the same sorts of support issues. And so there is a movement away from hyperscalers at certain sizes back into data centers where they can get access to their metal. If something goes wrong, they're able to diagnose and fix it and resolve it quickly on their own or with the support of the staff. And so it is really this constantly ever changing decision point. And what we try to do at Login is we try to help people think that through. Where is it right now? How long are you going to be needing this workload? Are you going to be on this thing for several years? Okay, well, then can we put you somewhere where you're going to get your best bang for your buck? Does it need to be highly performant? Even on the medical side, there's certain things that require us to think carefully through the workloads. Some of
Yeah.
the rendering of x-rays, for example, require GPU loads that need to be either on-prem or they need to be in the data center. So it becomes complex, but again, that's where the high level of engineering and the ability to be able to parse that apart and make those decisions really comes into play. And then that also plays into savings. We can say, well, rather than a one size fits all, where we just, here's your appliance, here's your thing, and you end up with a rack full of many, many different solutions.
Yeah.
We're looking at it, we can say, hey, we can actually combine a lot of this and share a lot of the workload and put something together that will save you a ton of money, but actually outperform all of those solutions because of the combined firepower of an enhanced CPU load or more memory or whatever it is. So that is one very, very strong benefit of thinking those things through with a service provider because of all of those net benefits.
Yeah, and I think genuinely from the experience that I've had, sitting down and really, like you mentioned, road mapping what the next few years looks like for somebody's very specific situation provides such a huge benefit, not from just an efficiency standpoint or even understanding what's going on, but also cost. Because if you
Yeah,
can at least roadmap what the next 3 to 5 years looks like, you can budget for the next 3 to 5 years with whatever provider you're engaging, or at least put in a solution that's gonna hold you until that time comes, right?
right.
with that pre-planning. And I think that's something that gets overlooked on a massive scale of, okay, we're looking to solve one very specific problem that we need solved in the next month, but we're not looking forward a year, 2 years, 3 years in the future and what that may look like if your business, kind of like what you were talking about with the hyperscalers, if you're looking to scale your business from 10 employees to 50 in the next 3 years, what does that look like? What preemptive steps do we need to take? And I say we as Login, um, to make sure that we're on the same page as you and put things in place in the beginning to make it easy when we do get to that scaling point, right?
Right.
And that's kind of the exciting thing when we do sit down with any business, is kind of figuring out what the next few years looks like. And if you're happy with where you're at, that's awesome. But most of the time, business owners want to grow, right? And figuring out what that growth looks like is a huge piece. And I think everything that you just said plays in a very integral role in that road mapping. So thank you for touching on that. I am curious, speaking on that roadmap, on your engineering experience, can you tell me about kind of that, instead of using the example of the one size fits all solution, a complex problem where, it required some crazy diag or scripting to figure it out on the MSP side?
So probably one of the most gnarly and complex things was getting an upstream. For me, it was getting an upstream provider configured with SMS,
Ooh,
and that's really challenging to do. Though Microsoft has now started rolling out their own solution for it, but for years, if you adopted 365, you needed to be able to integrate your phones with your messaging. And the part that was missing was if you moved to the Teams infrastructure and did Teams calling, you didn't have a way to be able to chat because of the way that Microsoft had things organized. And so other providers would start to step in and be a intermediary both on the phone as well as on the SMS side, and then allow you to put an app into Microsoft to do SMS, MMS messaging on your phone number, because you could do it on separate phone numbers, but you couldn't do it on your phone number. So being able to work through the transition from a standard phone system um, to porting those numbers over to a Teams infrastructure, as well as getting the that those numbers ported to this other provider, and then running the PowerShell scripting to be able to activate phones on that SBC properly, while also deploying the SMS solution into Teams and making all of that happen fairly seamlessly, so that when this distributed workforce, they were doing everything on their mobile phones. As each one of those things is happening, they're getting new deployments essentially to their Teams app, which is setting
right.
off all sorts of notifications. So trying to orchestrate all of that so that it happens, and then the 100 people that start calling in saying, what is all of this stuff, that there's the right communication going out, the right support for that. That was a pretty gnarly one,
That
but it was pretty.
sounds like fun, to say the least.
It was, but getting that right was tough. And then also just for my team recently, working through the process of moving from one soft phone vendor that works with our in-house phone system
Right.
uh, over to another vendor that was just a much better experience for our clients. Well, then we had to move our existing soft phone users over to the new soft phone. And on a hard phone, you put a hard phone on somebody's desk and they go, that's a chunk of technology. And I know you're going to help me configure it. Tell me what I need to do. How do I make all this work?
Right.
But the expectation when you roll something out to a phone, is like a smartphone, is it works or it
Yep.
doesn't. And if it doesn't work, there's 300 other ones. Why do I have to use this? That's just the mentality. So being able to script the process of moving from one phone, soft phone, to another soft phone on the same mobile device,
Right.
and try to make that a good experience to make sure that, we don't have two competing soft phones fighting with each other on the same mobile device while we're
Right.
in that transition. That was another, I would say, a very challenging scenario to make sure we're doing what's right for our customers in that. So I get those would be the two I would think of.
Yep. And I mean, just you kind of touched on it a little bit, but especially when you have end users being clients, right? The expectation, especially when it comes to an app on a tablet or a computer, or even like you mentioned, a mobile phone, the expectation is that you open it, you put in your credentials, and it just works, right?
Right.
There's no expectation that it's not going to work, and if it doesn't, I'm going to a different app. And I'm guilty of it too, and I'm not an engineer, but you're absolutely right. That is just the mentality, and it's kind of funny to think about it from this perspective, right? And how much work goes into making it a seamless experience, especially when
Mhm.
you're going through a migration like that. Um,
Yeah.
I'm curious. So, as we are an MSP, I'm curious what we're doing to handle cybersecurity threats, responses, and kind of mitigating those things as a whole. And when, let's say we do have an event on a client's endpoint, what is the first step, right? I think this doesn't get talked about very much. We talk about events happening, but you don't really hear about what the next step is. Okay, we had an event. What do we do next?
Yeah, good question. So let me back it up just a little bit to talk about, because you did ask about how do we handle cybersecurity in particular, and I think that kind of flows into the reaction
Yeah,
when there's an actual event.
yeah.
So first, MSPs need to have good technology. There are so many solutions out there, different costs, different levels. But when you say that you offer MDR, when you say that you offer EDR, and these technologies that are
So
these like buckets
I'm going to
that are
pause you for a
acronyms in the
second.
industry, when you say those things that you're offering those solutions, there are very specific things that you need to make sure that you have, and
So,
so that's a very, very important first part.
so just to pause for a second on what you just said, for the listeners that aren't sure what an MDR, EDR, XDR service is, can you kind of give us the layman's version of what those three things mean? Obviously, you and I know, but I'm sure we're going to have some listeners that may not be too familiar with what that is.
Absolutely. So the the difference between those, and there's various different ones, but um, the ones that people tend to talk about in terms of their um, different levels. EDR is a security service that just monitors. It's monitoring and reporting up to maybe a central hub of information, but it in of itself doesn't carry the expectation of a response. And
Right.
so while it may flag that to say, hey, something bad happened, uh, it is only saying we're going to be more or less the way to think about it is we're only saying that we're going to be scanning, we're going to be looking, we're going to be paying attention to what you're doing on the endpoint and flagging things that are suspicious or problematic.
Right.
So that's the EDR. The managed version of the MDR is actually a commitment to staff people to respond to those threats, and that's why those get expensive. And there are companies that at scale provide those solutions so that they can manage threats that come in very intelligently. So if you have an MDR solution deployed, it's going to be more expensive per endpoint. But if something happens, somebody's getting a phone call, and there is
Yep.
a mitigation process, usually by that provider, with people with advanced training in cybersecurity, threat mitigation, and recovery, ready to engage and work through that. And
Right.
that's a lot of the stance that we take. We are happy to help and engage, but there is a whole legal level to that as well. There's a certain level of compliance that insurance providers need to be able to provide. There's a certain amount of coverage that needs to be considered in those scenarios, so that when you have that managed response, you have the right people saying the right things to the right people to be able to recover. So that's where that big gap is. And then there's other levels like XDR and
Yeah.
centralized logging and all kinds of other stuff that you can layer on. And that is largely dictated at those levels. Those are largely dictated on the level of compliance to maybe a specific insurance policy or something industry specific relative to privacy. You've got kind of interesting things relative to, say, things like HIPAA and
Yep.
other personal information
Yeah.
policies that will
High
then
trust
dictate these things
environments.
that need to happen. So it there's a lot you can get into in terms of how the industry thinks about these things. But the
Right.
main thing to think about for most business owners is what's on my endpoint that's making sure we know, myself, my provider knows something's up. Because if you
Right.
don't have anything, the gap between nothing and something is far more important than between something and, the more expensive response models in
Right.
most scenarios, most businesses.
Right. And it's interesting because you touched on it a little bit with the insurance policy, which we're starting to see more and more of, right? And I think a lot of people are not deep diving into what those policies require to be effective if you do have an event. And I think MDR, XDR, EDR, which you just gave us the definitions for, thank you very much,
Mhm.
are playing a kind of an integral role in those security policies. But one thing, now that we're talking about it a little bit, we're also seeing people not being able to get these security policies for what you just described, which is lack of having anything in place. And can you tell us a little bit about what a remediation process may look like? Would that be kind of a deep dive into existing technology, what you're doing on endpoints, um, that sort of thing?
Well, again, before I answer that, I know you want to keep driving towards that, but before I answer that, it's the other parts of what is a good stature to have are really important.
Right.
So let me just touch on that quickly first. The second part of what you need, besides the good technology to be able to support your posture, is awareness and training. Um, the people need to know why they need things like multi-factor authentication, because with most places that's seen as a nuisance. Why do I need to do this? Why do I need to keep signing
Yeah.
in? Why do I need to, go find my phone and punch the code in, that kind of thing?
Right.
And that's very important. They understand that the best target to be able to compromise a network is you. 100%. It's not about crawling your way through a firewall or hacking your way through some sort of application, though that does happen. But the best way for an organization or a bad actor out there to try to compromise your network is you and your lack of knowledge or your lack of understanding, lack of awareness. And so security awareness training is a big component of cybersecurity that I don't think it's talked about very much. We've all experienced the fake phishing emails that come through, and you have to decide, is this really from my boss, or am I being punked here?
Right.
And
Those $500
those,
Amazon gift cards, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, when was the last time anyone gave you a $500 game? But
Yeah,
still,
right.
yeah, those techniques are helpful. That's a good baseline, and people need to have those things. Um, but also, they need to think these things through, just like you would if you're a kid in school and you went through a fire drill. How would you, if there was an event, how would you recover? What would you do? Who's the first person to call? Do you call login? Do you call your attorney? I mean, like, who do you call? And
Right.
what are you supposed to do? So being able to fire drill these scenarios is really important ahead of an event happening. That's a critical part of security. And then convincing everybody in your organization, you are the target. They're trying to get to you. They're trying to make you make a mistake, a click in the wrong spot, a thumb drive plugged into the wrong thing, whatever it is, they are trying to get to you because that's the most successful way to compromise security.
Right.
And so, and you can add to that like password policy. Yes, people hate having longer passwords. That's why we're moving more towards a key based society, if you will, where you have these super, super long passwords that are embedded into hardware keys that get used, or biometrics on your device
Yep.
itself that can be a key of themselves. Because people hate doing passwords. People, because they hate doing passwords, do dumb passwords. You have presidents of companies that still have ABC 12345, and they think, well, you know what? You can't make me not do this, even though I have access to all the corporate documents and all of the information. You can't make me not do this, so I'm going to keep doing it. And it becomes this political battle to solve one of the most basic elements of security, which is just good password policy. So that is a training thing. It's getting people to think the right way about it. Do I care enough about my business? I'm willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on cybersecurity, but I won't change my password. Or I've got all of this investment into the right technology in this, but all my people don't know what a spam email looks like or a phishing email looks like. It's a huge hole. So that's another huge component, is just getting people aware of what is out there and what they need to be careful about.
Well, and that's everything you just said kind of ties back to, if you have one or two people that are internal, do you think that they have time to be doing all of that security training? Probably not most of the time, and that's
It's a
another
lot
big
of work.
value add. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
another big
And
value add that MSPs can bring.
yeah, and whether that is, bringing us on premise to do like a training day, this has been a common thing when we've brought new clients on and they've had existing IT, or they are coming from a different provider or something. We offer them a time period where it's almost just a workshop. We'll be there with a couple of our team, and you bring your laptop, and we work through a bunch of stuff with you, and get everything reset and your password set and your phone set up with your MFA and all of that stuff. That seems like just like mind-numbing things to do, but
Right.
what you were doing in every one of those situations is saving your butt every single time, and you're enhancing your security posture just by working through all that and making sure everyone's in compliance. And so that, plus the security training, yeah, that's a ton for any one person to do. And so that is another great value of an MSP, is being able, and that's something that everyone should ask their MSP. How do I
Right.
get this training from you? How do I get the security awareness? What should I be doing? What should you be doing?
Yeah,
Um,
then honestly, it's kind of crazy thinking about how little effort for the most part gets put into that security training. And I mean, you touched on it a little bit of just MFA in general. Hardly anybody wants to deal with it, but I think it's because, like you mentioned, it's a lack of understanding in why MFA on Google or Microsoft or any other app that you may be using exists. And most of the
exactly.
time, it's to protect you from yourself, from
Exactly.
making that
Yeah.
mistake, right? And
Um,
me being the clumsy, kind of lackadaisical person that I can be sometimes, am thankful that things like that exist to protect me and my personal data, and also in a company employee environment to make sure that I don't make a mistake and compromise the business, right? That's the last thing anybody
exactly.
wants, but I think, like what you said, having that understanding of why these things are put in place is very helpful to get the engagement from an employee at a very basic level, right? So,
Exactly. And I would say probably the last thing that people need to consider, um, in terms that MSPs will typically try to recommend and help connect, is network and endpoint controls. Whatever that looks like, being able to say the network needs to flow through security devices, and endpoints need to exist on networks that are monitored and considered. Now there's work from home, there's remote work, there's all these hybrid things that need to be considered in that. But when you have a bunch of people all in one area, all connected to the same resources, you got to monitor that. And that is a big part of, why we push for endpoint management, why we push for managed firewall, beyond just some configured policies, but something that can detect on the traffic itself. Is this a threat vector? Are they trying to connect to something we know is bad? Like, you got to have that level of intelligence to it. Otherwise, it's just kind of open to the wild. So that's the other part that we're really trying to push with customers, is make sure that you are posturing the network itself to be safe. And there's a bunch of things you can get into, between like guess the network access, how do you manage different subnets that go through the firewall in different ways, and all of that
right.
that help craft that better security posture so that if something goes wrong, the firewall can clamp it down, or if something goes wrong, the individual endpoints can shut themselves off from the network and create security.
Right.
So that's a um, the kind of a final layer of the main offerings that we would try to encourage people to consider. But the biggest thing, and this is almost an entire podcast in itself, is the B word. Um, and everyone likes it. No one likes to work on it. No one knows what to do with it. Backups.
Yep.
Um,
I was waiting for it.
yep. Backups are so important on every level of everything that you do, from configurations of all of the different systems and stuff to the data itself. And data itself is always a challenge: where to put it, how to move it, how to protect it, all of that. But making sure that backups that you wouldn't think you would need to take. Well, all my stuff's on OneDrive and it's working great. Well, yeah, but did you know that if someone deletes all your stuff off of OneDrive, Microsoft has no obligation to protect that for you? No, I
I
didn't
mean,
know that. Well, then back it up. Well, how do I back up OneDrive? It becomes this whole expanding thing. So making sure that your critical business data is backed up, that you have copies upon copies of it. So if there is a compromise, worst case, you have a copy somewhere. And yes, there are some really advanced threats inside of malware that um, can infect your backups so that when you bring them back, it's infected again and all of that. But still, we have seen too many times, sadly, too many times, where the backup wasn't there, or, and this is the part why backups are and why fire drills are so important. The backup's there, but then when you go to restore it, it didn't work.
yep.
That's just miserable.
You're like,
So
oh,
testing
yay,
backups, like
no.
pulling a copy of your backup and trying to put it on something. How long did
Right.
that take you? Well, we've got terabytes of data in backups. Cool. You know how long it takes to move terabytes of data back to your premise? Even if you live in Tucson and we
Right.
drove a truck with a hard drive to you, it's still going to take us some time to get that
Right.
data out of our data center and to you. Faster than it would be from the cloud, certainly. But that's a lot of time. And then you got to make sure it works too. So there's this, and it gets back to that awareness and fire drill and testing things. Everyone should work with their vendor to say, hey, let's schedule a time to test and see how this would all go down. Let's game it out together. Because that level of preparedness, when disaster does strike, and now that's getting into the disaster itself, that is an order of magnitude better experience if people are prepared and there is an understanding of how long this will take to be able to maintain business continuity. And
Right.
so that's another huge part, is just the backup management and data management of the whole thing.
And to touch briefly before we kind of move forward, it's very recently I was actually speaking to somebody who owns a local business and they have a couple of salespeople. Ex salesperson was doing all of their salesy things on a daily basis via email. When that
Mm,
employee left the company, they cleared out the email thinking, oh, I'll just get back into it if we need anything, not knowing that all of their leads were going through this email.
I
Well,
don't like where this is going.
yeah, so let's just say they ended up not being able to access any of that old salesperson's emails, and the guesstimated loss in revenue was a couple 100,000 from one
It's
salesperson
awful.
leaving and not having backed up emails. Such
Yep.
a simple thing that most people are thinking, I'll get back into it if I need it. Nope.
Mhm.
And
Well, what is nice is that if it, like, so if say you're on-prem Exchange
right,
and someone removes that account, okay, yeah, you're that's probably just going to sit there. You deactivate the account, it's no big deal, unless you go hit the big delete button and then you just deleted everything.
right,
um, but it gets a little more interesting in, say, 365. Now, just a year ago, if you went into 365, and I actually had this happen, this was just miserable. Somebody's account, they wanted to move from one licensing level to another. And
Okay.
so both of these are exchange enabled licensing levels. I think it was from business basic to business standard. And at the time, when you went into the panel to manage everything, you uncheck one license and check the other license. But unless you went and checked inside of the apps, open up the apps that all those licenses give you access to, and ensure that the new exchange online is checked, you could click OK and apply it and go about your merry way and not know that you just triggered a 30-day disposal policy for all of their email.
Oh no.
And so that actually happened to me once. And thankfully, I was auditing, fire drilling, if you will.
Right.
I was auditing all of these changes. And I noticed when I clicked into the mail tab in their tenancy, it came up and said, this user does not have an active exchange license. And I looked at the licenses and I was like, but I know that one does. And so I went and opened up the apps, and sure enough, it was unchecked. So clearly, Microsoft has learned from this,
Right.
because from user feedback or whatever, because I've checked this on the last maybe 5 deployments that we've done. That
Right.
as we've added licenses or moved licenses, I'm like, wait a minute, let me go look.
I'm
And
gonna double check now.
yeah, it's checked every time. And
Right.
when we intentionally did that, we actually stripped off a license to be able to change to a new licensing provider. It's a Microsoft upstream thing, but change to a different licensing provider. I got an email, and it also put up a notification saying you are removing this exchange. Who would you like to have access to it for the next 30 days until we get rid of it? Like it clearly
Yeah.
the message was received.
Yeah, no kidding.
So,
Here's this big red warning of you're about to lose this in 30 days.
but
Either
it's
act now or
Microsoft too. Like this is the largest provider out there, right? They
right.
are the one that has been the mainstay for corporate business email, and everyone's trying to move their exchange servers to 365, and even they have some edges to clean up and whatnot. So back everything up, check your backups, test deploying your backups, build into your budget the cost of redeploying your backups to test them to ensure that you're good to go, because
Right.
that is the worst feeling, to have a false sense of security that your backups are awesome and then you try to restore them and you can't. That's just the worst.
I honestly I couldn't imagine if experiencing that even from the employee level
Yeah,
of not being able to access anything that I use on a daily basis. Like,
it would be horrific, and it happens to people all the time, sadly.
oh
Like
yeah.
it's just so okay, so going back to what is the process when there's a cyber event? What happens at an MSP?
Yeah.
First, all the alarm bells go off, right? Like if everything is considered right, we hear notifications. We literally have alarms in our network operating center that we can tie up that will lights off and put things up on TVs and stuff. Um, it is very much about getting attention on the problem quickly. So whether you are EDR and it's just raising the alarm, or it's MDR and there's actually already an expert on their way to solve the problem for you,
Right.
awareness is one. Like we saw it. And sadly, this happens too often, on-prem as well as with providers, where you go and look at the dashboard and go, look, that computer hasn't applied updates in 2 years.
Oh my lord.
Well, it's there and in front of you, but it's not alerting you that this is a problem. It's on the dashboard, but you're not always looking at the dashboard. So
Right.
very, very important. That stuff all has to alarm its way up all the way to make sure that eyes are on it, it's prioritized, it's cared for, communications go out to clients to make sure that all of that mitigation stuff is in place. The same thing
Right.
is true when an event happens. Hey, we saw that this happened, we need to hop on a call with you and talk this through. This happened actually recently to a client, and within minutes we had spun up a meeting, called them, had them hop on, brought up all of the dashboards, started investigating. And in this case, in that case, thankfully, it was actually a false threat. There was a change to an operating system file that a different piece of software that they used changed, and it just happened to flag it. And it looked like all the computers just got compromised.
Right.
It really wasn't. And so we had to work our way through pushing those exceptions through our software to be able to make sure that, the alarm bells shut off. But that's
That's
the first
almost one of
making
those.
sure you can see it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's you kind of touched on it with what you just described as the alarm. It's in the dashboard, but it's not right in your face telling you, look at me, look at me. So it's one of those out of sight, out of minds.
Right.
And then on the example that you just gave, it's more of a posture of being better safe than sorry, right?
Exactly.
It's we'd rather it give us an alert, even if it is a false alert, and work through figuring out that it's a false alert, then okay, we erred on the side of now we're being overly cautious. Oh, great. Yeah, we loosened up the security posture and we just had a real event. Yay.
Yep.
So, no, that's
Yeah. So that's the first, I would say, like the just the alarms kind of coming up is the first part that is very important. What is your notification? Making sure you understand it. So that's something we're constantly tuning at login is what are the best ways for us to know? What are the best ways for us to react? But I think
right.
then the process is we're finding who would know. So it's usually starting with our technical contact. We we and other MSPs should take great pride in contacting people before they know they have a problem.
Right.
We actually get kind of a kick out of it. If we can get in touch with you and be like, "Hey, guess what we saw?" That's always better than getting a phone call or an email saying, what is this thing?" So first, narrowing down that vector, trying to understand where it's coming from, using the tools and technology to understand what are we dealing with, why did it happen, trying to get close to the root cause, but not all the way not going all the way to root cause because that's a ton of time. Right now, we're just trying to get close enough to understand, was it one person that made a mistake? Was it a compromise through unpatched systems or something? How deep does this threat go? So it's very much this sit rep around how deep does this go? From there, we then, at least what we do is we call internally a call that our engineers will call out specific people that they need to get on the call to be able to resolve it, whether that's a network engineer or that's a level 2 tech or whoever that is. We'll get
Right.
those people together on a call and they basically sit on that call and work the scenario until there's an understanding and resolution. That includes going and validating backups and making sure that there's a good way to be able to restore if there's loss of data or anything along those lines.
Right.
And then once the problem is identified, a lot of times it's getting other vendors involved.
Yep.
An interesting situation happened with Microsoft recently, where a user that we had that had too much permissions clicked on something in their email that was actually a file. It looked like a file that was sent from one of their other coworkers. That was a common thing, and it wasn't even named the same. But somehow, this threat actor was able to probably because of a compromise on their machine or something that they were involved in or
Hmm.
something. When that email came across and that person clicked on that file attachment, because they were already authenticated on their computer as Microsoft 365 user but had too many permissions, it was able to leverage the APIs and rewrite all of her exchange rules behind the scene.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden she stopped getting email, and all of her email was actually by those exchange rules being diverted off to this bad actor.
Okay.
But it's very hard to see that because you don't know, like all you know is emails not coming in. You go look at emails that show up off of a specific exchange, they're all coming through okay.
Right.
But there's something about what's going on at that point. And we actually had to have Microsoft, and also we had another vendor that we got involved to help us diagnose this. They specifically said, we've seen this happen, and you need to go look at this one specific spot where these one specific exchange rules can be set up. And unless you know to look there, everything would just appear as normal, like, but just there's no email coming through. And
Right.
sure enough, those rules had been injected. And the only way for them to be able to do that is with that level of permission. So we're able to work our way through the mitigation of all of it, but that is what it takes to find that, remove it, and then go back through and resend through emails, either from restoring them from backups or resending them through the exchange, to be able to receive the proper emails again. And I would say that's a fairly mild threat, but that is typically how that process happens. When it is something like like a cyber attack on data itself, like a ransomware or something like that, it becomes even more challenging because it's not only how do we restore this, but how do we make sure that the restoration doesn't include the problem? And
Right.
so is trying to understand, when did this ransomware appear on the network? Oh, this person clicked an email yesterday. Okay, we're okay. We can restore from 2 days ago. But if we don't know, then it's not only restoring the data, but also putting it in a quarantine space, scanning all the data, trying to find that ransomware that's sitting as a like a hiding payload,
Right.
remove that, and then move that data back in. So it can
You
be
have
a
to
very involved
determine.
process to restore all of those things, depending on what
Yeah.
it is.
And that's what I was gonna kind of touch on is it seems there's definitely an idea that a backup can be deemed not a good restore point if you have multiple points to restore from, right? And you just
Yep.
touched on determining which one of those restore points do we need to go back to, right? If one of them from 2 days ago has that email in it, okay, we definitely don't want to restore from that. Or if it has whatever, and this is going to sound very horrible, but whatever Trojan horse is waiting, or that payload that you just described, it's kind of a scary thing if you don't have somebody looking through all of those restore points to verify that they are clean and ready to be used. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yep. And so there's even backup scanning solutions, there's file system scanning solutions, all that stuff that you can keep layering on to protect that. But the big thing is, if you have business continuity data, whether that's a high value inbox like you talked about, or
right,
corporate data share, make sure you have copies upon copies. Um, Honestly, data is cheap in comparison to the cost of recovering things. So work with your IT vendor, work to make sure that you have many backups, many copies, many ways of restoring yourself on those high value areas. Um, and then again, fire drill them at least once a year, fire drill them to make sure that you can restore and that those levers work the way that they're supposed to, because that's also just terrible. Like, I know I keep coming back to it, but that's just terrible. With any false sense of security in IT is a bad idea.
right. Well, John, we have talked about a lot of amazing things during this first episode, and thank you for joining us and
For sure.
providing a very, very high level overview of what an MSP can provide value wise. Um, Before we kind of sign off, is there any last kind of tips and trick that you would like to provide to the audience?
I would say that when you are thinking about your security, if you're a business that you're trying to think through the um, some of the scary things that we just talked about, have conversations with people like us. Have conversations with whatever IT vendor. Um, Ask them, where do you find out information about what you should be concerned about? What are the right resources? Because there's a ton of them out there. There's lots of like e-magazines and email subscriptions that you can tie into for free that will just keep you informed.
Right,
Um, Talk to providers that are trying to solve these problems and ask them what they think you should do. Even if that doesn't lead to some sort of business arrangement with the provider, you'll find that a lot of us, login is definitely this way, and I think this is true of a lot of people that get into service provision. They're there to help people,
right,
and we want you to know the minimum things you can do at minimum that you can do to make sure that you're protected. So
right,
give us a chance to share with you. Get in touch, ask questions. It's okay. It's not a bad thing. We want to help people understand. So look for that, and be proactive about protecting yourself. Just like you would if you moved into a house and there was no locks on the door, you would go, why are there no locks on the door? That doesn't make sense to me. Every house I've been in before has locks on the door. I sure would like a lock on the door. Who do I need to talk to about the lock?
right,
Have the same awareness about your business. I'm walking into an environment that's going to be under attack. I mean, it's just the world we live in now. What are my locks? What are the things I should know about? And how do I start working on all that stuff? Start the conversation. Um, and and you'll find that there's a lot of generosity in that space. There's a lot of people that like us that just want to educate, want people to know, so
right.
they can be better protected. So don't be afraid to start the conversation.
Well, I think that's probably the best piece of advice. And honestly, you knowing me, that's my biggest thing as well is don't be afraid to reach out and
Yeah.
ask for information. We're here to help. But with that said, again, John, thank you for joining us for the first episode of Login's Maximum IT podcast. Looking forward to the next one. Thanks and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Max. Talk to you later.
That's a wrap on this episode of Login's Maximum IT podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and visit loginbusiness.com for more insights. Got a topic you'd like us to cover? Let us know. Until next time, stay secure, stay smart, and keep maximizing IT.